Okay, hello everyone, how are you doing? So today's talk is going to be about unique trading opportunities in a DeFi world. It's going to be presented by myself, Freddie, and our lead architect, Yuri. We both work at a high frequency or ex-high frequency market maker or liquidity provider in the space, providing liquidity mostly on centralized exchanges, your Binance, Kraken, etc. But also now with a more recent foray into decentralized exchanges. So as of yesterday, we're one of the main market makers on DYDX as they launched their new central limit order book. So I don't know if you guys have been following that, but seen that go live. And my hope for the presentation today is to introduce those who are less familiar with some of the protocols, the basics of what they are, what opportunities they may present, what opportunities they may have now, but then also the risks associated with them. And it's split slightly into two parts. So the first part will be talking through three protocols. And the second part will be more of like an Ask Me Anything interview with Yuri, where I'll ask some leading questions, but that's when it would be fantastic if you guys could have any questions on part one, or with part two, asking Yuri specifically about liquidations, which we think is a key opportunity in this space, especially for players like us. I'm gonna have to stand over here so if I get in the way just to click. Oh, wow. Sorry about that, guys. Who's that guy? Oh, hang on a second. Apologies. I'm starting at the end here. Here we go. Okay, so can I have a show of hands of who's already seen this Alethio map? Okay, cool. Okay, good. So for those that haven't, what this is it is a network map. Oh, also, by the way, if some of the pictures are slightly pixelated, I hadn't managed to test it on something larger than my small laptop. But so what this is it's a network map of the current major DeFi protocols and people who are interacting with more than one. So those who are the yellow dots show that they're interacting with Compound and perhaps Synthetix, and others over here in the orange dots show that they're interacting with Compound, DYDX, and MakerDAO. So you can start to get an understanding of the composability of the space and the interoperability of it all, and you can see who's doing what, and then potentially learn interest on what, why, and what they may be doing with each protocol. Some make obvious sense, so things between Compound and Maker make a lot of sense because instead contract creators are specifically to do the CDP creations between Compound and Maker. So that makes a lot of sense that you'd see a large cross-section between those three protocols. Now, so some people haven't seen the map, but I imagine some people have used the protocols separately to seeing this network map. So for those in the room who use two protocols, could you put your hand up? Okay, cool. And who would be an orange dot with three protocols? Okay, and who would be a red dot like Yuri? Red dot is, four protocols, so four or more. Heavy DeFi user, okay, cool. So I think for those who sit close on the four, the pieces that I'll go through today may be a little bit basic at the beginning, but hopefully some of the protocols may be not the ones you use, and you might see some use cases with a few of them separately. So let's dive into a slightly less used one, but currently the leading derivatives platform, Synthetix. So we'll start with what it is. So Synthetix is effectively a way to get synthetic exposure to any asset. So what that would be is you can take a proxy of an asset that doesn't currently exist on chain, and through a set of pricing oracles, you can basically get exposure to that asset that you wouldn't usually be able to get. And so why is that interesting? So as you can see, so the currently supported assets are, you've got your fiat coins, you've got your cryptos, both long and short, which is interesting. So BNB is an example, which is the exchange token of Binance. You didn't used to be able to particularly get any short exposure to it. So this isn't what synthetic exposure allows you to do is to get access or utility to exposure profiles you wouldn't usually be able to access to. So that's what's exciting about the system. It's very scalable, and I think what's quite special about it is anyone with an internet connection anywhere in the world could now get exposure to an asset they wouldn't usually be able to. So I know, for example, in a previous role would trade Chinese stocks, but on an American exchange. So I'd have to do American depository receipts. This potentially, whilst the liquidity might not be there, this potentially has the possibility of being able to do that from anywhere in the world without restriction. Now, so what kind of backs this? How are these Synthetix created? So SNX is the native token of the protocol, and what happens is those who stake SNX are able to mint synthetic USD. So a set of pricing oracles. Does everyone know what pricing oracles are? Okay, cool, yeah. Just yes, so those who are able to stake SNX, mint synthetic USD, and then using the pricing oracles and the available assets of those oracles are able to gain exposure to those assets. Now, and so what's quite interesting about that is, so let me just go to the opportunity actually, apologies. So those people who stake are able to gain synthetic exposure, and then they're able to sell that synthetic exposure to others who want to enter the system. Because the way that the system works is that you can only mint quite a low portion compared to the collateral you put up. So if those of you familiar with the MakerDAO system, it would be the equivalent of you're locking away your ETH and you're minting the lowest collateralization, which is 150%. For the synthetic network, because SNX potentially has to be the collateral against all exposures that the synths can be created, it has to have a much larger collateral ratio. Now, when SNX users swap their synthetic USD for perhaps a synthetic short Ethereum or a synthetic 4 times long Tesla, well, there's a fee, and that fee is roughly about 30 basis points. So the way that SNX holders earn money is actually collecting fees when people who are using this system swap their synths from one debt to another. And so you can kind of see that the core drivers for the network are basically the ability to first create synths, and secondly, increasing the amount those synths are exchanged. Now, what's particularly interesting about this network at the beginning, other than its quite explosive growth, is firstly the monetary policy of the network was recently changed from being a fixed supply token to a inflationary supply, and actually quite a steep one that actually will have a 75% increase in the number of SNX tokens, and therefore SNX available to mint synths to those users who stake it in the system. So the reason why they did this is because previously, as a fixed supply token, they couldn't necessarily, and this is very needed for this type of network, they couldn't get the buy-in for people to mint the synthetics. Some people were taking lots of just kind of speculative risk on the increase in SNX token. Everyone has been told HODL is the way to go. It's a fixed supply. You know, there's similarities to Bitcoin in the long term, so that made sense. But for this specific network, to gain its actual network effects, it's very important that fees are earned by the exchange, and as such, more synths and more utility is added to the network. So they did this through an inflationary policy, and so there is a potential for those who currently have SNX to get deflated away if they don't participate by staking. Now, you can see this at the bottom, the current locked SNX ratio, and therefore the amount of synth debt that has been minted is at 80% of the entire network value, which is quite impressive. I think it's probably one of the highest participations for any network of any of the DeFi protocols. And then secondary to drive value to this SNX, and why I think it's potentially interesting or an opportunity, is the other kind of portion of how value is driven. So one is this synth creation. They've added inflation. They've got buy-in of the network. There's the potential for more SUSD and thus other synths to be minted. But it's actually about the exchange. So those are because you've got such a large amount now locked in the system, it's quite hard for any individual in this room to go purchase SNX, mint only an eighth worth of its value, and then get that level of exposure. It's not a very financially savvy way of doing it. So what they need is a gateway into the ecosystem, so that someone with one token can swap quickly in and then get synthetic exposure without having to participate as a equivalent, like a buy-in or like a miner or a holder of the collateral. So what they've set up is this Uniswap bridge between SF and ETH, so that's synthetic ETH and ETH, which should kind of always keep kind of a one-to-one peg. And I'll introduce Uniswap for those who aren't aware of it later, but just bear that in mind. So it's all about creation of value is through the minting of synth. Its potential is that it's globally accessible and gives you access to potentially any exposure, and there's no liquidity premium charge when swapping from one oracle to another price. There's just the fee from refactoring your debt, which is very, very scalable. But just keep in mind that the team is incentivized to both increase the total value of the network and also increase the utility of each synth and the users in the system. So what do we see as some of the risks? So one of the risks is through this incredible network participation, you actually now have a very illiquid token backing this synth debt as collateral. And so given the amount of synth that can be minted is a function of the value of the network, and the value of the network is just priced off the available supply, it could be quite easy to manipulate given that there's quite low volume. So that's one risk to be aware of. And I think Yuri's probably the best person to touch upon some examples where if you're trading synth, what happens if someone managed to make such a large profit on one of their trades? Could that end up causing the system to be under-collateralized or collapse?
Right. So that's the similar question to what's going to happen with the blockchain network if someone gets more than 50% of hashing power. Now, it's the same here. Synthetix network is relying upon having a large supply of SNX locked in the network. And as number of users increases, as there are more and more people who are trading synths on the exchange, indirectly that would affect the SNX price, the native token price. So the price will go up, the whole market value of the network will go up, and it will be only harder and harder for people to make enough profit to kind of kill the whole network. But in theory, it is an existing risk. It is possible, especially with the future plans of adding leveraged exposure, like let's say 4x short Bitcoin. So potentially, in theory, you can get, let's say, half of the value of the network, and you can swap it to leveraged 4x short Bitcoin. And then after a while, if you want to take your profits out, the network simply won't have enough money to pay you off, and the whole network will collapse. So this is the negative side. But if you look at the, let's say, game of large numbers, in theory, it shouldn't ever happen, because the SNX supply should always be higher than the amount of money an individual can put in.
And I think what's also important is, naturally, as more synths are created, not only will you see a pattern of what users want to trade, but the collateralization ratio will be a function of what those users are trading. So it's currently DeFi, and there's an incentive to mint synthetic ETH long exposure. So as you can imagine, a lot of people have minted synthetic ETH long exposure. So if that ends up being profitable versus SUSD, the collateralization of the whole network will drop. Another thing that's quite super interesting actually, and potentially something you may have already spotted, is in this kind of early and nascent stage, not factoring in liquidity when repricing debt can lead to some interesting oracle failures. So I think probably again, Yuri, I think one of the most interesting ones I heard recently, and maybe you can talk to how they handled it, was the Korean won fiat pricing oracles. They originally had, I think they had 3, but 2 failed at one point. So they were only taking a simple average, I think it was a simple average, of 2 remaining oracles. And one of them started broadcasting, it could potentially have been gained, but one of them started broadcasting an incorrect price, but so incorrect that it was pricing Korean won versus the dollar at 1,000 times its actual value. So what that meant was anyone with Korean won could exit at a 500 times profit due to the averaging into Synth USD. And if there was a gateway out of the Synthetix network, they could take profit pretty quickly. And I think their arbitrage bot actually amassed about $1 billion worth of profit, which is obviously far more than the system could have coped in about an hour.
Yeah, that did happen. The whole network obviously relies on the correct pricing from centralized oracles to provide a correct price for the assets. And if that price is wrong, because of the unique feature of the network that you can trade as much as you want against the smart contract. There are no requirements in terms of liquidity. It's not like centralized exchange where you, let's say, trade 50 Ether and you push the price down. That doesn't happen here. You can trade as much as you want, literally billions, against smart contract in one transaction. And that doesn't affect the price. But what it means, if Price Oracle gives not a very good price or even a little bit off price, someone can take advantage of that, which, as Freddie mentioned, happened in the past, and get insanely large profits. Luckily, in that situation, they managed to get some sort of a deal with the person who did that, and they reverted the trades. But again,
I think they got a bug bounty of around $2,500, so not quite the billion they were hoping for. But I'm sure they woke up with their automated arbitrage bot quite happy when they saw that.
Yeah, but also that person didn't really have a choice, because
the network value would have collapsed if it held on.
Yeah, and also with all those networks, what you have to be aware of, that they control the protocol and they also control the ERC20 tokens. So even though you have ERC20 tokens in your wallet, they might still block all the transfers of those ERC20 tokens.
Yeah, so there's absolutely a centralized kind of point of failure there. I won't touch too much on liquidation policy or other competition for the synthetic assets, other than the fact that the entire new, oh, interesting. Other than that was exciting. Other than the fact that the whole synthetic asset, the ability to proxy on-chain exposure to any and more complex profiles, is an exciting space, and people like Maker, for example, could easily do it with DAI versus other oracles. And I know the UMA platform are doing it with more financial derivatives. So I think the next one I'm going to go through is probably the one that everyone, if anyone put their hand up saying I use one or two, it's compound, right? So at the forefront, explaining what compound will be new to a few of you, but probably quite common knowledge now for the majority of people. So I'll go through it quite quickly. But what is it? So compound kind of really nailed it. So they really nailed it in terms of lots of people were sitting on crypto assets, and previously they were enjoying such large gains in the dollar value of their exposures, because, or at least very highly volatile gains, that they probably weren't too worried about the inflation of the system actually eating away at any of those profits. Crypto winter came in, people can continue to build. Compound finance really kind of built what has always been there in traditional finance, but is far more open and flexible in decentralized finance. And that is one of money markets. The ability to go from a negative yielding asset where you have to store, there's risk of theft, and actually there's potential that the asset you're holding is being inflated away. And now creating quite a simple place for you to deposit your assets, lock them away, and earn interest of others borrowing them. It was twofold really, because it allowed traders like us to get kind of a leveraged position on an asset we were interested in, quite a flexible way, but also allows people to short assets that they wouldn't have previously been able to short. I think probably potentially a lot of the people in the room or people who are new would have discovered this because of interest rates on stablecoins. So stablecoins, those which try and keep parity to some more stable traditional fiat asset traditionally, have quite good yields in crypto. Yields with a risk-adjusted return that often outperform ETH prices and changes in price. But yeah, so for example, I think the main lending pair on Compound is MakerDAO's DAI stablecoin, and that's been earning pretty much on average yields of over 10% per annum. So whilst there are risks, it's whether you believe the risks that I'll discuss just after the opportunity page outweigh the difference between the risk-free rate on the dollar and the risk you believe you're taking with changes in price of DAI versus that dollar. So version 2 is actually what became very interesting because they added utility to the system. So what they basically did previously, what's happened with the change, is they introduced a new ERC20 token, which was a representation of your balance in one of those deposit pools. Now, that sounds like kind of interesting. Sure, there's now an exchange rate between CDAI and DAI, and it's kind of slightly more complicated, and how does it work? But like, Yuri, why do you think that C tokens are quite major? And what do you believe, what are some of the examples you think it could be useful in the future that will be interesting?
So what's great about C tokens? Let's take a simple example. Let's compare DAI and CDAI. Now CDAI is pretty much your DAI, except it always earns interest on top. So CDAI value is guaranteed to be at least DAI value plus the interest. So I wouldn't be surprised if 1 year from now, majority of people who hold any DAI in their wallets would be holding CDAI and they would be using CDAI for payments. Now the only risk in doing that now you rely not only on the safety of maker smart contracts, but you also rely on the safety of compound smart contracts.
Yeah, that's correct. And so what in essence you've got is you now have a token which traditionally the upside or the interest would have been locked away until it was withdrawn, but now you have a token which can be both traded, used as collateral elsewhere, which is known as rehypothecation, which is basically just where someone who deposits their assets, those people now use those deposited assets to either gain additional leverage or earn interest anywhere else. That's also common in the traditional finance, but the fact that it's represented in ERC20 and can be transferred anyway and used in other DeFi protocols to earn additional yield on your token, which is already yielding block time by block time, is quite amazing, really. Just one last thing, actually, and I think another thing, and I'm not sure who people have been following it, but another really interesting thing about Compound is the fact that it's so easy over the short term to now borrow tokens is, I think the most recent vote, I think it'll probably be confirmed tomorrow, is for Maker. So Maker's actual governance token is about to be voted in as one of the pooled tokens in Compound. And that's very interesting because now you have effectively a variable rate pool that allows people who didn't originally hold the token to borrow it on the basis of voting for the interest rate on DAI when they hold all of their CDAI. It's going to be, I'm not sure what the ripple effects of that will actually end up being, but it's something that we're following very closely and is very interesting, especially as the Maker system, if the Maker system continues to grow, you're going to get more and more buy-in and more people looking for, I guess, voting power in the system to keep it secure. Yeah, so again, what are the risks? So there's always going to be contract security risks. There is, interestingly, some centralized points of failure at the beginning. So Compound specifically have set up, like a lot of projects to be fair, have set themselves up in a centralized way to begin with and are slowly handing over to a wider spread governance and more decentralized model, which you've seen work. I think one of the pioneers of it were, well, we know what the real pioneers were, but Melonport would be quite a good example of people who were actively pursuing this model from right at the beginning. Even Maker are doing it as they switch over to multi-collateral DAI. They'll stop relying on effectively having potentially backdoors or systems that might be deemed as not fully decentralized, and then they'll switch over. And this is exactly the same for Compound. And also the rehypothecation. This is what you actually end up doing by allowing others to take your collateral. So I think Dan Alitz has said it best. He's talking about superfluidity of collateral. He saw examples where, and I think it was actually the founder of Instat was talking or proposing that all of the excess collateral currently locked up in a Maker CDP could be swept and pushed into the Compound pool to earn additional interest, just kind of maximizing the utility of everything available. But as we said, the risks associated with adding one protocol to another, its composability is incredible, and the fact that it's auditable and public should help us assess the risk better. But as time goes on, this is all going to be additive risk. You're taking additional platform risks, so you need to be aware that the yields you're getting for taking those additional risks need to be worth it. Okay, so finally, let's tie them all together. So Uniswap. So this is one of everyone's favorite, and I'll try and tie both the mixture of the CDAI and also the Synthetix incentive programs as to what you might be able to do with Uniswap. So what is Uniswap? So it started off as a Solidity project, a sideline Solidity project, and then got an Ethereum grant. And it is a DEX. It is a place where you can do the decentralized swapping of two ERC20 tokens. And But what's interesting about it, so we come from a more traditional market making background, so we're experts in central limit order book. Well, hopefully we're experts in all types of market making, but traditionally our expertise would have grown in central limit order books, the find that you find common in all stock markets around the world. But the way Uniswap works is a little bit different. So the way Uniswap works is it runs something called an automated market maker. And the way this project specifically works is it uses one with a constant product. So to give you an example, let's say I wanted to create a market for Ethereum to DAI. So, and the current price of Ethereum is $180, give or take, 180 DAI, sorry. I'm already saying DAI is dollars now, so gotta be careful. And yeah, so what's interesting about this is if I wanted to exchange from the 180 DAI pool to the 1 ETH pool, let's say, for example, I wanted to withdraw some ETH, I would add, for argument's sake, let's say I add 18 DAI and increase the DAI pool by 10%. To keep the product of the two quantities of each pool the same, thus the exchange rate, I would have to decrease Y in this case, which would be the Ethereum pool, by 1/110%. And so, and you can kind of see that as those pools get larger and larger and these kind of exchanges and swaps for tokens occur, the slippage that you infer by doing the swap kind of reduces. And so that's one thing that's very worth noting in Uniswap. It was kind of like an incredible way to get access and to swap from one token to another in a decentralized way, but it is not the forefront of price discovery. It still relies on price discovery elsewhere in more centralized models. It relies on arbitragers to note that if the price of Ethereum has gone up here, I can swap and get cheaper Ethereum here, accounting for slippage costs and gas fees, etc. And so that's kind of how it's the consistent arbitrage between Uniswap pools and their exchange rates to traditional exchange rates of the assets that generate fees for this network. So this is important. So if you want to be a liquidity provider, for Uniswap, then what you would have to do is you have to supply an equal amount of ERC20 token A and ERC20 token B. And you supply it at the current exchange rate of each pool, and you're given a pro rata share of the balance of that pool. And then when you withdraw, you're given the additional fees that pool has earned through people arbitraging, keeping the exchange rate together. Now, it does sound quite a lot like C tokens, and I think Yuri has more experience than I in terms of integrations and using it already for automated processes. And in part two, actually, I think when we discuss the liquidation in particular, maybe you can discuss how we use Uniswap in particular for this. But I want to kind of tie Synthetix and CDAI to Uniswap and to give you an example how the composability of these different DeFi protocols can allow you to just get just that little bit extra yield if you understand the risks. So I think Cyrus from the MakerDAO Foundation probably did this best. He did an assessment of the profitability of different liquidity pools in Uniswap. And if you just ignore any of the assets they put in, if the exchange rate of the assets changes quite significantly from the exchange rate at which you inserted your liquidity, you kind of suffer from a thing he described as an impermanent loss. So this is something that basically says you should have hodled, yeah, you got some fees, but you would have been better off keeping the ratio of assets you had originally, because that would have been more favorable in terms of the price direction. Now, another way of flipping that in the head is the conclusion is any market that earns liquidity fees, so ones where people actually are happy to swap, but also is unlikely to deviate or will, you believe, come back to the price point at which you entered liquidity, is likely to be the most profitable. So I think the most profitable Uniswap liquidity pool so far has been ETH to DAI, because ETH since 2018 has actually come back. So everyone's like, oh my God, you're doing 20% liquidity fees. But actually, if you looked at any other point in time where ETH price changed, you would have suffered from this impermanent loss if you'd have withdrawn. So it's great now, but not great always. However, now that we have the introduction of CDAI and DAI and the incentives that SNX introducing with SF and F, you can see these liquidity pools shouldn't, unless there's a real failure in the system, deviate away from one particularly. Now that's interesting because we know we're not going to suffer from much impermanent loss. So any kind of liquidity pools which don't deviate in price much, but do continually earn lots of trading fees, are going to be the best risk-adjusted returns in terms of supply and liquidity for the pool. So this is fantastic. You have SNX, which is already going to provide an incentive scheme for you to provide SF and F to this pool because it wants easy access into the system. You know that people who want to get any exposure they want will come through this liquidity bridge into the synthetic network, so trades will be high, and you know that the price isn't going to deviate much between, shouldn't deviate much between SF and F, so you know you're not going to suffer much impermanent loss. So in essence, you're able to earn the incentive scheme, you're able to earn the liquidity pool. The liquidity pools are the Uniswap fees, and we think that that's just like one quite simple and easy to explain example of how you can earn additional yield on your assets, or an opportunity that exists in the DeFi space that wouldn't exist elsewhere. Great, so now we're going to switch over to part two. So for those that knew everything about, about all of the protocols, and actually everything I said was wrong and misguided, then this is a chance for me to kind of ask leading questions to Yuri about liquidations in particular. So if you don't know what those are, the first question is going to be, what are they? And we'll go through it. But this is a great chance for anyone to ask like really detailed questions, if you'd like, about how liquidations work, why it's an opportunity, and how to go about capturing it if you believe it's possible. Cool.
Right, so for liquidations, a lot of protocols, or pretty much majority of protocols that rely on debt, have the same problem. What are they gonna do when the price of collateral drops below the price of the asset that was borrowed? And that's why they need liquidation. Now, as I mentioned, majority of protocols do that, but not all of them. As we were talking about Synthetix before, they try to do a bit different approach. They try to use carrot instead of stick, and they say you just earn higher rewards if your collateral ratio is higher. So potentially that might be a way forward in future, but for now we still have liquidations, and that will stay for us for a while. And what liquidations means that when a collateral value is close to being below the value of the tokens that were borrowed, any third party can come in and literally pay off the debt and receive back the collateral. And by doing that, they would earn a small fee, which is typically around 5%, I believe.
Sure, yeah, for compound, I think the liquidation penalty is 13%, but yeah, you get a 5%. It's quite standard to have a 5% haircut on the underlying collateral that you as a liquidator can purchase at that time. So I think what's worth noting is, again, traditionally liquidations happen all the time. There's like margin calls, but they'd be done by centralized authorities. In decentralized protocols, they've kind of just given some open function calls that say, here you go, do this service for us, or everyone participate. So it's a kind of it's open to anyone to have a go and attempt to purchase those discounted collateral rates. But as we personally believe that a background in kind of more high frequency and kind of low latency work, coupled with some blockchain expertise, might mean that what on the surface looks like a great opportunity to everyone, you may actually never see.
Yeah, that's a good point. It was an attempt to decentralize the debt and the middleman who would hold your collateral and they would do the liquidations. It was a good attempt, but unfortunately that wouldn't really work in reality, because whenever you get an opportunity to earn high enough returns, bigger groups of people or companies like ours will step in and they will just manage to do it faster than any individuals. And in most cases, you wouldn't even able to see that there was opportunity in the first place.
Can you speak a little bit to why? So I think actually a good example would be, so Maker ran something similar. I think on their when they first launched it, they had a tool which basically showed the available collateral which you could purchase, and they had a tool which directly allowed you to purchase that collateral at a discount. I haven't checked in a while, but I imagine competition has increased, and so you probably don't see it as often, even though liquidations are happening. You'll see on LoanScan potentially that the amount of liquidations on Maker, but you could have watched like a hawk all the time on the Maker dashboard, and you've never seen any collateral come available to purchase at a discount. So kind of what's going on there? Why potentially do you not see it?
Ultimately, everything comes down to the speed. Whoever is the fastest to submit the first transaction to liquidate the loan will be the one who will get all the profits. And sending up transaction first is not a simple function of how much gas you pay or how quickly you see it. There are a lot of moving parts, and majority of those parts are how quickly can you read the data. And normally if you read the data using public providers like Infura, you're already too slow. Second question is how quickly you submit your transaction. And again, if you're using only Infura, then you're probably too slow. You would want to build something in-house with a set of nodes that are connected in a particular way that would give you the speed advantage. And then even if you submit high enough gas price, but your infrastructure is not good enough, then someone with lower gas price for his transaction can still be in front of you. And this comes to look very similar how traditional HFT, high frequency trading, appeared on stock market.
Yeah, so I guess to slightly summarize that, it's on the basis that I was going to ask the question, isn't it just gas price?
Yeah, as I was saying, it's not that simple. Gas price is one major factor in deciding which transaction will be mined first, but it's only one of the factors. The other factors would be how quickly you read, how good your infrastructure are, how quickly you submit transactions.
Do you see, so how do you think, and I haven't asked this question before, but do you think there's a way that the protocols can perhaps further decentralize this process, or do you think actually it doesn't make sense to, because people who are capable of executing and covering the system's risk it is enough of a backstop?
There are some attempts in the similar areas to address this issue, and all sort of issues with front-running, especially front-running price oracles. And the easiest solution was to set up a gas price cap so that all transactions you wouldn't be able to send a transaction faster than, let's say, 20 Gwei. Now, this might work well for price oracles, but for more complicated scenario like liquidation, where the profits can be significantly, but quite large, that probably wouldn't work because people who have good enough infrastructures will still be able to come ahead of general public.
Yeah, please.
How prevalent is collusion with miners? Meaning, if your firm reached out to a particular mining company, you could theoretically get your transaction basically whitelisted, put to the top of the queue. Do you guys see that? Do you guys comment? Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Would you mind repeating the question?
Yes, so the question was how common it is, or whether it's possible to collude with miners so that they would give you an advantage of mining your transaction first in front of other transactions, even though originally your transaction wouldn't be supposed to be mined first. Now, this is a very valid point, but the problem is normally the price of doing that and the price that you would have to pay to miner, or the price of getting that sort of agreement with the miner will be much higher than the actual profit you will get from liquidations. And even if you get that agreement, you have to remember that the biggest miner will have, let's say, 30% of hashing power, like not more than that, which means you will be able to do that only in 30% of cases. And they're just not good enough. It's much easier to build your own proper network of nodes that would be processing transactions better than your computation.
So one question on that, actually, on the network of nodes. Don't you find that it would be better to plug in an already existing network, because the infrastructure you need to deploy to do that is rather expensive and very hard to maintain properly, and to the extent where you have already a lot of efforts in analyzing the data of the mempools, etc. Do you think you need also that kind of network edge? Because it seems very expensive to set up.
Yes, so the question was, isn't it better to simply use some sort of third party that have already built that set of nodes that would give you that opportunity and infrastructure to execute your transaction? In theory, the answer would be yes, but in practice, all those public providers are just too slow. They never cater for speed. They cater for giving data to the public, and they don't care about speed. And here, for you, every second would matter when submitting a transaction. Because when you submit a transaction, you would think that only 15 seconds matter, which is the time frame of how blocks are mined in Ethereum network. But actually what matters is whether your transaction will get into the transaction pool close to the miner before the block is mined. So you're not just looking at 15 seconds blocks, you're actually tracking it second by second. It's much faster than the actual mining time.
Okay, and so I guess another way to put the question is, do you think the opportunity right now is worth setting up such an infrastructure?
That depends to what extent you will go, but we have seen that there are groups of people or companies or let's say competition that have quite advanced structure for doing liquidations.
I think to answer the question with respect to do you see it as opportunity, there will basically just be an economic inflection point where you go, if you believe the growth in networks which will require liquidations will increase, and trading volume, for example, on DYDX, for instance, might increase, then yes, it's about building the infrastructure now on the basis that given there is a speed advantage and an expertise element to it, there will be moats built. And it's whether you are taking to assess you can't assess the IRR of your investment on what's happened before, because no, it isn't there. So yeah, in terms of any collusion with miners, that's not how we view the space. But I don't think the miners would really have the incentive, and I don't think that people just doing liquidations have the incentive, because it's a 5% haircut on all liquidations that have ever happened, and there's just not enough money.
And it's good to know how large the opportunity is, and I can give an example that on just DYDX themselves do approximately several millions in liquidation every month. So if you would be a liquidator, your profit would be 5% of that, which is large enough to be setting up your own infrastructure.
Correct.
Do you think these protocols will actually change the way liquidations work? Because it's a very simplified way at the moment, just like having 5% haircut, and it kind of just attracts such behavior, like getting like free rent, front running everybody. Is it just because we're in the beginning? How will we deal with different collateral which is less liquid? Yesterday, Maker were talking about like kind of real world assets. So how do you see this evolving like over the next like years?
Yeah. So the question was, do we believe this will change in the future, and whether we believe liquidation as it is now will stay?
Exactly.
Now it will definitely stay for now, maybe for a year or two, but we can see examples of how people do it differently. As mentioned, SNX, they simply say you can't get rewards if you're under collateralized. So you need to maintain your collateral ratio or you can't get rewards. And so far it was proven pretty successful. They don't have any issues with the collateral. They don't do any liquidations. They just give the carrot and people follow it. And
one other thing I'd speak to is, you're correct. It's quite rudimentary and quite just a simple, this is the way it works, and there's growth and there's profitability, and then people, in the same way that miners have expertise in ASICs, have kind of specialized to compete with one another. The one thing I would say is, yes, I would predict and hope, so one thing I'm super excited, one of the reasons I joined the space was, in traditional finance I did something called XVA trading, which is kind of assessing counterparty credit risk. And what excited me was, with the MakerDAO model, if you had something whereby the actual CDP didn't always have to be over collateralized, on the basis of if you could prove the identity or zero knowledge proofs that perhaps you have liquid assets currently lent out on Compound that are available in a snap, people can start, it sounds sad, but people can start taking trust in a trustless system. And I think that's the way it will have to go for it to really be worldwide adopted in the financial industry. And so I would say, yes, more complicated, and like not more complicated, but more, it won't be as rudimentary as just a 5% haircut. But if you imagine with respect to liquidating illiquid collateral, you want to make sure that the people who are incentivized to purchase that collateral know how to deal with it and are best suited to, over time, not impact the market, sell it to people who can actually use it for better utility than perhaps you can. And that is probably always going to be some kind of specialism. We as market makers, we don't want there to be a market of 100,000 people with equal, just kind of an equal say in a trading market. We do expect that market makers will be a lion's share due to their specialism in trading and liquidations, in basically managing risk and handling the liquidity of assets. But we think that markets aren't just one. They shouldn't be completely a monopoly. There should be 3 to 5 for any healthy market, financial market to exist. And we think the same thing will happen with liquidations.
So I know that physical assets and physical derivative trading probably is limited to the scope of, and the size of those markets is limited to the size of the physical market.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on market making, high frequency trading, liquidity providing for synthetic derivatives or things like algorithmic stablecoins or things that are not over collateralized?
You mean on decentralized exchanges?
Sure. Or let's say you had an algorithmic stablecoin trading on a centralized exchange or something like that.
So just so I can just repeat the question and clarify it. You're asking that kind of what's the potential scope of synthetic derivatives and other kind of algorithmic stablecoins that wouldn't have existed traditionally in the new space that we're in?
Yeah, just because most of what we discussed is liquidations for over-collateralized things or physically backed. What I mean by physically backed is backed fully by collateral that you can then purchase. What do you think about synthetic derivatives where they're not physically backed by assets? So for example, in DeFi, you've got physical underlying collateral you can buy.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, it's a super interesting question, and I'm sure other people in the crypto market, it's something that we'll think and brainstorm, but it's not something we've necessarily fully dived into. I think with respect to Synthetix, like you said, it's currently capped by the collateral backing it. So that's actually its current maximum scope. I'm excited when trust or risk starts to enter the system, and the scope of that increases. But with respect to any individual, I guess with respect to liquidations, that would definitely require a new model if you're purchasing something that's going to be under collateralized, but perhaps the reward is greater for the individual.
And I can probably add here that the only example that we have of derivatives on chain now, or the only one that I can think of, is Synthetix. And I don't really see those Synthetix assets being traded anywhere else other than on their own native exchange, because their own smart contract guarantees that you can trade or exchange as many of those tokens, synthetic tokens, as you want directly against their smart contract. So it doesn't really make sense for anyone to go to the centralized exchange to trade against very illiquid order book of those synthetic assets when you can trade unlimited amount at fixed price against the smart contract. So probably we would need to wait and see of more implementations of derivatives on the exchanges or as protocols, and we would need to see how they will go about that. But as of now, I would say it doesn't really exist.
With the same respect to the simple 5% haircut liquidations, at the moment the pricing of synthetic assets is simple. I say the Korean won example was just a simple average of 3 or 4. We would expect that would have just exactly the same kind of risk that any kind of pricing or index would have. So we expect that to become more complicated and probably take into account liquidity.
I have a question on kind of your back-end system. Do you guys deploy contracts yourself to do things in a more sophisticated manner, or do you generally just call specific just from whatever wallet you're using? So do you deploy smart contracts essentially to automate some of your systems, or just all on-chain logic?
Yes, the question was...
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes. The question was whether we deploy our own contracts or we simply send transactions from our wallet and use some sort of centralized endpoints or something like that. And the answer is, it depends. If we would look at DYDX, they are, let's say, half centralized, and they are built on a protocol very similar to 0x. They probably took a lot of logic from 0x, and they have a lot of centralized endpoints. And with them, you can't even work from the smart contract. You have to work from their own endpoints. But if you're doing anything else, let's say if you're working with Compound, if you're working with Synthetix, and you want to be competitive, you will end up writing your own smart contract. Especially that there are so many tricks you can do in your smart contract to get ahead of the competition.
Sorry, follow-up question. When you're doing that, how do you avoid potential detection of your strategies when I can go in and see, okay, this address is consistently interacting with Compound, and I can go and see, okay, now this is your strategy for interacting with Compound?
So the question, how can you avoid detection? How can you avoid competition seeing what you are doing? And in theory, you can't avoid it because everything is public on the blockchain. But in practice, you can see the smart contract, you can see the transactions, but it's extremely hard to decrypt it and decode it and see what it's doing because all of that is compiled. You can see the gas price, you can see the transactions, you can see the address, you can see the smart contract is there, but that's it. You have no idea what it's doing.
Etherscan does have a decompile bytecode these days that does give you broad strokes in the form of functions these days. So I just want to.
No, correct. I think in an on-chain world, everything is far more public. However, just because the reason a function was called in a certain order for a certain liquidity pool, you would have to know our global positioning on both decentralized and centralized to warrant whether we did it as a, was it an ARB? Were we hedging? Were we actually taking a slight future prediction of price based on some change in a centralized order book that you don't have access to? So yeah, there's definitely things that you could probably glean. But yeah, anything that is purely proprietary and purely IP driven would be. Okay, I think that might be it. I think we've had enough questions, but thanks all for your interest and the interesting questions. Yeah.